I have another video request for you. Amazing Tech 2471 said, "Sir, can you make a guide about free-to-play custom gear? How to know which best stat is the best?" My response, certainly. So let's get into it. When it comes to custom gear, which you pretty much get almost anywhere, you get multiple pieces of gear. One of the first things to point out here is you want to get them up to 6 stars. Don't convert them, don't sell them, get them up to 6 stars. This does cost a lot of gold, so if you need gold, I would sell them over converting them, unless they're 6 star. 6 star should only be converted, never sold. Reason is you're going to re-roll a lot of these to get the obelisks that you want. So for example, if I scroll down to the bottom, I've got 402 of these re-roll stones. You get these by hitting convert. After checking a box, you check a box for a couple of these and then you hit convert. So the ones that are checked are going to be converted to a 6-star stone. Lower than that, they're just used for like forging upward. So basically if I have like this 5 and I hit quick upgrade, it's going to use the lower ones first and then it'll use the 6-star ones. Don't use 6 stars to get these to 6 stars, always use less. So if you have a 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 5, keep reforging them together until they're to 6. Which ones you work on is going to depend on which ones you want. Each one of these is going to have like an orangey kind of color here over on the far right for cold damage. And if I go through this, mind damage, each one of these is going to have an orange stat, guard break immunity on the top. That's locked in. No matter how many times you reforge that from a 1 star all the way up to 6, it stays there. If you re-roll it, it stays, but the percentage, if it's percentage based, guard break immunity is just guard break. But if it's something like mind damage, it's got a 23%. That is going to vary and change, and we'll go over that here in a second. And then the stats below is going to vary as well. We'll go over those here in a second. Also, by going to one of these gears, and then we'll go ahead and change the options, and I'll show you how all of that works. Before we get there, there are icons on these, and there's 3 icons that you'll see. The first icon that you'll notice here is this little, it looks like a bubble or like a honeycomb circle. And what that is that's invincibility. So every single one of these with that icon will have invincibility somewhere on the obelisk. The next one is this little sword icon, and that is for a damage proc. Increase basic damage by, then there's going to be a percentage for 1 attack. Some of them will be lower, some of them will be higher, all the way up to 200%. So as long as there's a sword, that's a damage proc for a single skill. We talked about the bubble, and then the last one is a little broken shield, and that is guard break immunity. So any of these ones that have a shield on them, that's that guard break immunity. It could be in the top, it could be towards the bottom. It's just going to vary. So this one here has both guard break immunity and it has one of those damage procs, but it's only showing the guard break immunity shield. So it could have both, and I don't know the order it goes in. Probably the one based upon the top, I believe, and then it goes down from there. But those are the 3 different icons that you'll see. If it doesn't have an icon, that means it has other stuff. It's just not one of those 3 that I mentioned. Let's go ahead and talk about re-rolling one of these and getting different chances. Everything below this orange can be re-rolled to a random value, and there's not really a way to lock it in. There's a way to lock it in and keep re-rolling till you get it, but there's not a way to keep that in that position. It's only the top one that gets locked down. So for example, let's say I have this mind damage here and I want to re-roll this. I would go here to change options. Then it pulls up this screen. On the right-hand side, it's going to show the materials that I can use. They need to be at least 6 stars. So you don't want to use your obelisks. You can lock obelisks that you like. As you see here, I've got this lock icon, so you can hit lock, and then it can make sure it's not used or sold for reforging or re-rolling, or if you were selling, which I don't recommend. But if you do this here, it's going to grab anything that's out there that's not locked. So by locking it, it won't appear on this screen. So unless you want to go through and lock everything, I just recommend you avoid those. Instead, convert everything that you don't want that's 6. Anything below 6, like I said, those are fine to sell. I prefer to upgrade them to 6 so that you can turn them into stones, but that does get pricey. Once you've got your stones, then you can start using these to re-roll different options here. So you'll see here, we have options, and this little flip thing here shows that this is for re-rolling and changing what they are. So right now we haven't made any choices, so it's not doing anything. Mind damage is locked in here, and it's percentage based. It can be between 20 and 40%. So if I go back here originally, you'll see it's at 23. If I go to something like the guard break immunity one and I change it, That's locked in there and I can't change it. And that's because guard break immunity cannot vary. It's just guard break immunity. So I'm going to go back to one of the ones that have like mind damage, and I'm going to hit this little edit, and now you can slide this bar wherever you want. What you're doing here is you're setting your options for the lowest acceptable score. So if you're willing to accept 20, leave it alone. If you're saying, I want 40 and nothing less, I want 40% mind damage, then you hit settings and it's locked in. It has to be 40 and nothing else will be accepted. So if you drop this down, shows the gold number there. Keep in mind, the more options you put in, you could burn through all of your items and never get it because it's random each time. Pay attention to what you think is most critical for that piece. My recommendation is, if you pick a stat you like, and it's locked in there, like mind damage, consider the lowest possible denominator. Between 20 and 40, like, would you be willing to accept a 25% if you get the other stats that you really want? If you only care about the mind damage, crank it up. But if you're willing to do less, consider, maybe you just want to lock in 25 and then hit your setting. For most of the time, I don't lock that in. Most of the time, I don't. Just being brutally honest. So what's option 1? When you select option 1, you will notice a lot of these look very familiar. It looks like the orange stats. That's because when you look at any of your obelisks, you're going to get 2 stats at the top and then a third one at the bottom. Your 2 stats at the top can be the same thing. You could have mind damage in either of the top slot or bottom slot, and sometimes you can get it doubled up because, again, they can be used together. There you go. So double mind. So it is possible to get the same stat twice and then they stack together. It just depends on how important that is to you when you're rolling through here. So on that second option, I want to talk about some of these and I want to give my opinion because it's mainly the thing that folks are asking about, what I think of each of these stats. I'll tell you right now, everything that says immunity to, I think is worthless. I really do. Immunity to stun has its place, like getting stunned against like like one of the beasts or something, but for the most part, I just don't think you're going to get a lot of use out of stun. Same thing with immunity to web. That might be nice for PvP, but that's why you have like debuffs and stuff. So I would avoid all immunity. I would never get immunity on purpose. So that's these top ones. There's guard break here, and then there's these immunities here. Guard break is worthwhile. Guard break, this is where you need to know the game and understand your characters. When somebody's in the middle of a skill, if you guard break them, they stop their skill. This can be devastating for some characters. As an example, Doctor Strange, he has very long animations on his spells. If he's guard broken, he can't use his spell. So for him, guard break immunity is critical. Now there's different game modes, different ones that are going to use it more than others, like in PvP and stuff, but even in ABX and ABL and World Boss Legendary, you can still get guard broken. So figure out which character is critical to have guard break immunity and put that on them. Sometimes the CTPs will have this built in as well. Doctor Strange is the first one that comes to mind. I don't have a full list, but I can try to get one if folks are interested. Next one's recovery rate. Recovery rate are for characters who already have recovery rate to get it up even higher. It helps with survivability. That's, again, a niche thing, and it depends on which characters. So think of characters like Deadpool and Wolverine, Hulk. They're already healing. They're already getting recovery. Increasing the recovery rate is how much they're getting from their heal. So if you have maximized your recovery rate, you're going to heal a lot quicker, and it's going to be harder to kill you. This has some value in PvP. For the most part, I usually don't recommend recovery rate for most characters. Dodge is one of those stats you should be getting from your cards and swords, and your ISO 8 sets and your ISO 8s themselves. You should be able to cap your dodge fairly easily at 75% cap. If you are struggling and your character really needs it, you could choose it. I don't recommend choosing dodge for an obelisk. Ignore dodge. This is one of those things that just helps you hit characters that are very dodgy. This applies in both World Boss Legendary for characters that have high dodge, but it also can work in PvP as well. For the most part, I would avoid it. I don't think it has a lot of value in an obelisk slot. If you're doing World Boss Legendary that's very, very dodgy, I would use a leader who has ignore dodge, someone like Cable or Gambit as an example. Critical rate is another one of those stats. It caps at 75. You can pretty much get it from your cards, your gear, different options on your 4th gear slot, your ISO 8, things like that. So for the most part, critical rate is kind of a hit and miss. I don't think it's bad to have, especially when you're a newer player. But critical rate, since it's a lower cap, I usually try to avoid it as a main one Like I said, if you roll it, it's fine. I just don't think it's a main goal most of the time. Critical damage is a little bit different. Critical damage is very hard to cap. It's 200%. And a newer player is probably going to struggle with it more. Even players who have really good characters that have their crit damage pretty high because of their cards and stuff might have potential need for critical damage. This is one I would consider having actually an orange stat, let alone a secondary one. But both critical rate and critical damage are decent. Ignore defense, you should be capping on all characters at all times, and honestly, should never come from an Obelisk. This should be from your cards and from your other stuff. If you're struggling with ignore defense, there's probably builds to look at for your whole account versus getting it from an Obelisk. I would avoid this one. Max hit points give survivability for PvP. There are characters like Victorious and Hulk who scale their damage based upon their hit points, so you could consider this for the right character. Mostly it's going to be a PvP thing. All basic defenses. For the most part, I think this is a worthless thing to have. Not that you don't want it on your account, period, just not on an Obelisk. I usually try to avoid this. It's mostly helping with survivability and just having your characters last longer, mostly PvP oriented, I would say, for the most part, because if you're playing your characters right in PvE, this is not going to come into effect as often. Fire damage, cold damage, lightning damage, poison damage, and mind damage are all elemental damage types. If your character has their skills saying a particular type, those are the ones you want to go for. An example of this would be someone like Human Torch and all the skills say fire damage. Or Thor and all the skills say lightning damage. If they have one or two, I would avoid using it. But if they have multiple skills or all their skills saying a particular elemental type, I would go ahead and use that as probably a primary, and if you can, get a secondary as well. So all of these are fantastic for PvE content. The resists, for the most part, I kind of feel are worthless, so I would avoid those altogether. They just allow you to resist certain types. So poison resist does have a place in World Boss Legendary, but I feel like it's wasted on an Obelisk, so I wouldn't aim for it. In summary, guard break immunity is good. Recovery rate and dodge, niche for PvP. Ignore dodge, I would avoid. Crit rate and critical damage are okay, even though crit rate I consider less so. Ignore defense should come from cards. Max hit points is good for PvP. Any of the damage ones based upon your character, if you need elemental damage, those are the types of things I personally feel are best to try to roll for on your Obelisk. So you would pick the ones that you're willing to accept. If you're looking for a specific thing, let's pretend we're trying to do a double mind. So that, remember, the first one's locked. So now we can say another mind, and this one I want to at least be 24%. And then you hit settings. So now you're trying to roll, and you at least want to get 24% on both of these minds. So I want to double mind 24. Remember, the more specific you get and the smaller window, the more you could be rolling this to get this. So keep that in mind. The last option here is the bottom one, and this is kind of drawn into categories. So it shows your current one, and then you have categories. This category here, you'll see that it has this little trophy icon that shows the highest possible that it can get. You can check this, and you'll see it, oh, it grabs 6 options. Well, if you check this box below, you can go in to this subcategory, and you can see all the options. So the best one here, 5 seconds of invincibility with an activation rate of 50% or below. That's why in this one here is 40 with 5 seconds. Now it's 50 with 4 seconds. That's not as long. So see how it kind of gets worse. So you decide which one is your best stat, and that goes for all of these here. It's not always 6. Like sometimes over here, like if I grab one of these, that's 3 options underneath. So you can go into the options if you want. If you're only willing to accept the best, no, it's going to take more rolls. So sometimes it's okay to kind of open that up. See, here's this damage proc that I was talking about, and there's 5 options. So now we can see what the lowest one is. So the lowest one is 120. So 120, 140, 160, 180, and 200. 200 being the best. Now let's talk about which one of these I think are best. The hit point recovery stuff, this is actually good for PvP. It's going to give you some invincibility, help with survivability. It's going to activate and try to help keep you alive. So if you had something like a guard break immunity with an invincibility, and then something like max hit points, that's a good PvP obelisk. But I think most people are going to focus on PvE. So the next one here is the proc. This proc, like I said, can go up to 200%. Honestly, I don't think I would ever accept, for me personally, anything less than 180. So I would check these 2 options personally. You could accept less. I just don't feel like it's worth it. Now, The thing to keep in mind, and again, you hit the settings to lock it in, this proc means a single skill proc. So if you use any other skills, your proc's gone. If your character is not proc friendly, you do not want this. So this goes back again to deciding what your character's rotation is, where you're going to use them, and what's more important, procking or one of the other things that we'll talk about. An example of someone who procs is like Human Torch. You can do 4-3-5, and that's fairly decent and easy to proc with. Someone like Sharon Rogers, pretty easy to proc with, versus someone like Magneto or Doctor Strange, or even Jean Grey, you virtually spam the skills as soon as they're ready, and it's really hard, if not impossible, to get it to land with one proc with one skill. You just want constant damage. That's where things like your anger procs will come in, which we'll talk about in a moment. This one over here, so you see here, this has invincibility. This is similar. This is an activation rate based upon the percentage of your hit points, but it recovers. So it helps with survivability. For PvP, I think invincibility is better than the recovery. Honestly, the recovery, I don't think this one is really that good. You can consider it for different game modes, especially PvP, but I don't consider this as highly usable. It depends on the character, though. If your character has built-in invincibility, you might not want to double down. Maybe you do want to do recovery, so that this way they become invincible, and then this can heal back up and help them heal up quicker. So it depends on the character. Or maybe they're so dodgy they're hard to hit, so while they're recovering, they get this little boost of recovery. That's something to keep in mind, but I probably would skip that for the most part. This one here is going to be an activation rate, 20% rate when hit, and it's going to apply to enemies, and it's going to freeze. So cold damage, 350% of energy attack, freezes the enemy when attacked. This one could come in handy in PvE. I honestly don't use it ever and don't recommend it. Even though I can see a reason you might consider it, I still don't like it. This is probably the next best one for PvP under invincibility, and that's where it creates a shield based upon your hit points. So if you have a real thick, heavy hit point pull, and then you create a shield that helps to protect you, I think this is pretty good. I would prefer invincibility, but this is not too bad either. Again, PvP focused. This is an activation rate self. It gives a barrier. I don't really like this one that much. I think the invincibility one is better. Again, it has survivability usage, mostly in PvP. Immunity to all debuffs, completely worthless in my opinion. You should have a debuff leader, debuff support, which is rad, removes all debuffs. Having the immunity to debuffs just means you don't get debuffs, so they don't need to be removed. Rad, removing them when they're applied, is good enough. I don't think I would waste my time with this. The last two is what I call the anger proc. It's like a rage, if you're familiar with those, and if you're not, I'll explain, but it's half of it. So the one half over here, these two are identical besides for the stat. So you increase basic damage by 1% per 1% of your critical rate. This says the same thing, but it's dodge rate. And what that does is, during a certain time period, before, the cooldown time is 8 seconds, so for 5 seconds, while that proc is cooling down, you get this 1% of 1%. So if it's 75, which you want to cap that stat, or over here, 75 for dodge. If you have 75 critical rate, that's 75%. Same thing over here for dodge. So if you go in here, that number drops. Now it's 0.9, so increases by 0.9 per 1%, increases by 0.8 per 1%. So the 1's the best. I think the 0.9 is acceptable. Obviously, if you can get the 1, that's even better. This is going to be for characters that don't proc easily. Like I said, as an example, Magneto and Doctor Strange are examples. Or if you just don't want to deal with the proc. Both of these are very viable options. Those are the different types of substats. You pretty much pick what you want, and then you just say, reroll. You can do it 10 times. You can auto-repeat as many times as you want until you get what you want. And then you can lock it for use later. So here's an example. I lock this one because it's cold damage, and it does 200%. So it's a single proc, 200%. This one's locked because I've got cold damage or critical damage, and it's got invincibility. So this one might be more geared towards PvP, potentially, but the cold damage critical rate alone might make it decent for some PvE game modes. Lightning damage, critical rate, 200. Double lightning with an anger proc, and this is a crit rate one, so it's got the 0.8. 0.8's the lowest it can be, but it's got the double lightning. So I might put this on someone like Thor, as an example. Lightning damage, I shared that one already. I locked this one. Guard break immunity dodge with a 200 proc. I like the 200 procs because they used to be hard to get. This one's guard break dodge and 200. So very similar. The difference is this is 18 and this is 16. So I thought both of those were decent. What else do I have locked here? Just as some examples. Ignore defense. And then I have cold damage and 200. This one I have recovery rate, ignore dodge with invincibility. Double recovery with a 160. The double recovery I thought was kind of neat. I honestly probably would get rid of that one. But just give you an idea of like some of the stuff that you can do. And then some of my characters, I have a lot of CTPs. I probably should have started lower. Let me get to a couple of the custom gear that I used and kind of just give you an example of some of them as they're... I'm sorry, I've got so many... There we go. So as an example, Ebony Maul here does mind damage. So there's a double mind damage with a proc. Next one. So this is semi-filler. Fire damage does nothing for him. Critical damage does help. So if I go to info, details... Critical damage is only overcapped by 4%. And from that, I'm getting 37. So only 4% over. So I was under critical damage. So I gave him a critical damage. And then I gave him an anger proc that's based upon his crit rate. And his crit rate is 75. So I can get that 75%. That doesn't count. Oh, here's another one. So we have a critical rate fire damage. So his old Phoenix 5 uniform, which I still swap to when I need a villain support, does help from the fire damage if I use him. But for the most part, Cyclops is pretty strong on his own, but you're not really going to use him many places with Shadowlands, honestly. So I just gave him the crit rate one. And then this here is based upon dodge. Usually if you have a dodge, or crit rate, it's better. But I mean, if you're capping the skills, it really doesn't matter. So in this case, I have a 68% for dodge and a 75% for crit rate. This is based upon dodge, so he's not getting the maximum. So I do want to increase his dodge to get the most out of this. This is actually suffering. Not only is it a 0.8, but it's also not max dodge on the character. That's the type of stuff to keep in mind and to keep an eye out for. So those are just a couple examples. Crit rate, crit damage, both awesome options. 180 is not too bad, and he is proc friendly for Carnage, so... You know, just giving you a few samplings of why I pick what. Guard break immunity just for the guard break. Lightning damage does nothing for him. It's 200 proc because he's super proc friendly for Iron Man. Double poison resist with a 200 proc. I did it for the 200 proc. The poison resist just helps with World Boss Legendary. For the most part, this was a junk one. I just kind of threw on a proc for him. This here, honestly, I think he's actually proc friendly, so I probably could have thrown something like an energy on him. I heard people do really good in World Boss Legendary with Ant-Man, but critical rate. Poison damage does nothing for him. Sometimes you do have to settle when you're going through, so just keep that in mind. So, but you got the basic idea. This actually should be a proc. I should probably swap this out with a Destruction Reforged because she's fantastic in World Boss Legendary. I just threw this on because I was using her in PvP. So the guard break with the shield... And then the critical damage is not bad to have just to help with that critical damage. So look at your character. See, the critical damage is still not capped. So any that I can get here, even 31%, and it's still not capped. So it's like at 150 for her. But yeah, look at your characters, know your characters, understand what your account needs, and go from there. So hopefully that was helpful. If anyone else has other questions, I'll do my best to answer them and share my opinion. As always, ask multiple people, get multiple opinions before making decisions, but let's talk about the game. We all love it. Let's have some fun. Catch you next one.